the government of Alberta and the federal government have created an Alberta-Canada Working Group to discuss energy policy. Now that's primarily for the electricity sector and around the oil and gas emissions cap. Most of Alberta's issues around energy policy are on the table, according to the terms of reference. So we'll see how this plays out. But what's really interesting is over the last couple of days, Premier Danielle Smith and Environment Minister Rebecca Schulz have released statements that contain what we in the journalism business call whoppers. And I want to debunk those whoppers for you because this is important in the discussion around for these issues going forward. So the first one, number one on the hit parade from Danielle Smith is, and I quote, "Albertans have cut emissions more than any other province this past decade." So in order to check that claim, I went to the Government of Canada's GHG inventory data, and I checked to see if that was correct. Well, it turns out that since 2005, the 9 other provinces have actually either lowered their emissions or they've plateaued. There's only one province where emissions have risen, and that is Alberta, the exact opposite of what Premier Smith has claimed. So apparently black is white. Now, number 2, as stated repeatedly, she said, "We stand ready to commence the federal-provincial working group in good faith to align Ottawa's and Alberta's efforts toward achieving a carbon-neutral economy by 2050. Now, when I sit down across the table to discuss something in good faith, I expect respectful conversation and taking, somebody who listens and takes into account my concerns. What the Premier did is she basically accused Federal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault of perhaps being a communist and certainly being, an agent of the Chinese government. And the reason for that, where there actually is just a smidgen of truth in this, is that back under Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney in the early 1990s, there was created the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. And Canada is a member of that group, and federal environment ministers over the decades, no doubt under the last Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, have been attending these meetings. And I'm recording this on September 1st, and no doubt I think this is the last day of meetings. And there's nothing to see here, folks. He's not an agent of the Chinese government. He's simply participating with other international governments and providing some advice to China. But it's rather extraordinary that a premier of a significant province like Canada would make these kinds of insinuations. So anyway, that's number 2 debunked. Here comes number 3. And again, I quote from the Premier. "Under no scenario will the government of Alberta permit the implementation of the proposed federal electricity regulations or contemplated oil and gas emissions cap." Here's the problem with that. In 2022, the federal government released the discussion paper on the oil and gas emissions cap. And the only 2 options on the table were carbon pricing. One was a cap and trade, and the other was the industrial emitters tax that already exists, and charging the full price instead of the discounted rate, the carbon tax, that we currently do. And I'll explain that as grist for another video, but that's essentially the approach. Well, the problem with the Premier's statement is that some of the provinces, including Alberta, already challenged the federal government's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and the Supreme Court of Canada sided against them and said that what the federal government was doing is constitutional. So the Premier can't just say it won't happen, we won't allow it to happen, when it's already been considered declared constitutional, ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court, and the federal government has every right to do that. Okay, now we're going to get to Environment Minister Rebecca Schulz, and there's only one whopper here, but it's a good one. So she cites in her statement some modeling that was done by the Public Policy Forum that shows that the cost to Canada of a net zero grid by 2035 would be between $1 trillion and as high as $1.7 trillion. And the Premier has said publicly over the last couple of weeks that that number for Alberta would be between $200 billion and $400 billion. And here's what, quoting Schulz again, she says there is a better path forward, one that doesn't threaten families with blackouts and soaring costs. Okay, so last year, the Alberta Electricity System Operator, and that's the organization that's tasked with actually managing the Alberta power grid, issued a report where we had modeled net zero by 2035. And there were three pathways, three scenarios. One was mostly natural gas with carbon capture. The other one was mostly wind and solar and battery storage. And then the third would be a hybrid of those three. But here's where it gets really interesting. I interviewed Miranda Keating-Erickson, who's the AESO's VP of Markets, and she said that the cost for those pathways would be between $44 billion and $52 billion. That's a far cry from $200 billion to $400 billion. But get this, 90% of the cost would be paid for by the private sector. Now, why is that? It's because that 90% would mostly be building generation, building wind farms and solar farms, or building natural gas power plants. It had nothing to do with no direct costs passed on to or paid for by the taxpayer. And furthermore, wind and solar now are the cheapest way to generate electricity, particularly solar. So, and we know that as we go forward and we're electrifying our economies, switching to electric cars and heat pumps and so on, we know that we're going to need 2 times to 3 times more electricity by 2050 to do that. And so this generation has to be built, generating capacity has to be built anyway. The private sector is going to do it. They're going to pay for it. And presumably the likelihood is that that activity will not directly affect the cost that Albertans pay for electricity. In fact, you can go on our YouTube channel and find my interview with David Gray. He talks about economic withholding, which is started to happen over the last couple of years and under the UCP, and is directly a consequence of UCP change in policy. And that's why Alberta's electricity prices have doubled in the past 2 years. So another whopper debunked. Stick around. I'm going to be doing more of these in the coming months. And if you have some kind of an energy policy or an energy information and energy issue that you'd like to have debunked, you can get hold of me on social media or email me at markham@energi.media.